I just pulled up to TCH Social in Las Colinas and I just got a text message that my 1-2 seat is available. Yesterday, we got a little bit lucky the very last hand of the session when our set turned into a full house against a flopped straight. So today, I'm hoping that things go a little bit better and we don't have to end up getting lucky to win on the sessions. So let's get in there, play some hands, and of course, as always, get some good ones for the vlog. I'll see you guys inside for some 1-2 Texas Hold'em. I made it to TCH Social in Las Colinas and I'm ready to play in the 1-2 No Limit Hold'em 300 max buy-in game. I got my chips and I didn't even have time to film or get my camera out before I'm dealt into the big blind. I look down at pocket kings. This is going to be one interesting vlog. Hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get into some hands. Alright, so like I said, I was still setting up my stuff, getting situated when I get dealt pocket kings in the big blind and there are 6 limpers. I just sat down, so obviously I don't know how the table's playing. I don't want to raise too small and go multi-wave pocket kings. I also don't want to raise way too big and have them all fold. Again, this is just something I start to get a feel for when I just sit down at the table. So I chose a size of $25. The original under the gun limper and middle position call, so we head 3 ways to a flop of Queen 4-6 rainbow. This is a seemingly really great flop for our hand. Our opponent's gonna flop a lot of second best hands, some straight draw type hands, some Queen X of course. So in general, we want to be betting a little bit smaller, being out of position multi-way, but as an exploit against players who make a lot of calling mistakes, I'm gonna size up just a little bit larger and I bet $45. Only the under the gun limper calls, so now we're going heads up to a turn card, which is an offsuit 3, so now the board is completely rainbow. Now we have to think about our sizing here with SPR getting a little bit shallower, and if you guys don't know what SPR is, it'll be on the screen. This card does complete some 2 pairs and straight draws if my opponent was limping under the gun with a hand like 5-7 suited. However, we have pocket kings and overpair. Our hand is still very strong, so I want to pick a sizing where if we have a safe river card, we can have a really nice river jam size. So I'm going to go a little bit on the smaller side, setting up for a river jam, so I choose the size of $80. My opponent makes the call again, so now at this point, I know my opponent has to have something somewhat decent. I'm thinking he probably has something like Queen Jack, King Queen offsuit maybe, if he doesn't raise those types of hands under the gun, which a lot of these players at these stakes don't. We can rule out a lot of draws like flush draws because obviously there aren't any on board. And another thing to note is if our opponent had a hand stronger than our overpair, I think we would have heard about it by now. So at this point, I'm very confident our hand is the best hand. We head to a river card, which is an offsuit 6. This card seems like a very good card. We were looking for somewhat of a blank on the river and I think this one is it. So we're gonna follow through with our plan and go all in. As soon as I go all in and put my chips out, my opponent snap calls, and I know when he snap calls, we are beat, but I don't know how. I get to find out very quickly as my opponent flips over 5-6 offsuit, flopped middle pair, turned a straight draw, and river trips, and I just drove an hour and 10 minutes to get felted on my very first hand getting dealt pocket kings. I think any way we play this, we're just losing the hand no matter what. If we check to him on the river, he's gonna jam anyway, and then we're gonna have to make the call. And on the turn, I don't want to size up and jam because we get all those hands to fold. Sure, my opponent had some equity, but long term, we're just printing money when my opponent decides to call us with 5-6 offsuit. So very unfortunate first hand. We are now stuck 300, but we're gonna top up. So now we're in the game for 600 and we're down 300 chips. In this hand, the $5 straddle is on, and I'm in early position and look down at the beautiful 8-9 of clubs. I raised to $15. The cutoff and the straddler both calls, so we're gonna go 3 ways to a flop of Jack 4-6 with 2 clubs, so we flop ourselves the 9 high flush draw. They check it over to me, and I'm gonna be betting my worst flush draws in this spot because we have 9 high, so we have no showdown value, but we do have equity, and we can turn some straight draws. I'm gonna put in a bet, so I bet $20. Only the straddler calls, so we're gonna go heads up to a turn card, which is the 8 of spades. Now we have showdown value with our pair of 8s and a flush draw. Our opponent makes a bet of $35 and I make the call. The river is another 4 and now my opponent leads for $60. The question here is, am I beating anything that he's betting for value? The answer is probably not. It also really sucks that we block clubs, so it's less likely he had a missed flush draw. So a lot of the times my opponent is just gonna have some type of Jack X holding here. We also don't have the best 8X we can have in this spot. It'd be better to have a hand like Ace-8 suited, for example. So exploitatively, I'm gonna make the fold here, although I'm not quite sure about this one, but I let it go and my opponent takes down the pot. So at this point in the session, I've only played 2 meaningful hands and lost them both, so I started to feel myself getting a tad bit frustrated, maybe a little bit tilty. So when I recognized this, I immediately tried to reset my brain and realized the path I was going down and tried my best to stop it. So we got to top up a little bit here, so now I'm going to be in for $650 as I top up another 50, try to keep my mind clear, calm, focused, and continue this session and hopefully turn it around. In this hand, I put the $5 straddle on, and there are 4 limpers, and I look down at Ace-Jack offsuit, really great hand to show up with in the straddle. We're out of position, and we know our opponents are a little bit sticky pre-flop, because remember, we got called by 5-6 offsuit earlier on when it was a limped pot. I get asked all the time how to combat going multi-way. You raise and you get a bunch of callers. The answer is simple. Raise bigger. Find the threshold where most of the opponents will fold, and you can go heads up to a flop, because that's the ultimate goal, is to go heads up or take down the dead money pre-flop. So in this case, we're gonna raise to $40. Everybody folds, so we pick up over $20 of dead money, which is a lot of big blinds in this game, without having to see a flop, and that's a great result. So don't be afraid to continue raising, find that threshold where you can raise bigger and either get heads up or take the pot down. In this hand, there's a limp under the gun next to act folds, and then I look down at pocket kings and the low jack. I'm gonna raise to $15. The player on my left, the one with the 5-6 offsuit, I noticed he's pretty sticky pre-flop and likes to call a lot of hands. He makes the call, the big blind comes along as well. The original limper folds, so we are going to go 3 ways to a flop of ace, 5, 6 with 2 diamonds. The big blind checks it over to me. I have one player in position against me, however, he's going to have a very, very wide range of hands, and the big blind should too in theory. We do have the king of diamonds, so I think our hand is good enough to put in a bet and see how our opponent responds. We're not going to bet too big on this texture, being out of position, so I bet $10. My opponents didn't have much at all, as they're going to have a very wide range of hands and a lot of misses on this type of board, so we take down another pot. In this hand, we find ourselves in another tricky spot on the river. It's a straddled pot, it's limped around, and I'm in the small blind with pocket 7s. I decide to limp, so we go 4 ways to a flop of 6, 4, deuce with 2 hearts. We have an overpair on this board. I'm not sure if I should be leading or checking, but it is limp pot, so I lean towards betting, so I bet $16. The player on my left calls, so we're gonna go heads up to a turn card, which is the queen of diamonds. My opponent probably has a heart draw, maybe a hand with like a 3 in it, maybe a hand like 5-6, something like that. So I want to continue betting for value in this spot. We can get called by a lot of worse hands like a 6, straight draw, flush draw, and unless my opponent had a queen high flush draw, he shouldn't have hardly, if at all, any queen X. So I bet $20 and he calls. The river is the 5 of hearts, probably one of the worst cards we could possibly see, so I check. My opponent bets $50. Again, we have to ask ourselves, is our opponent going to bet for value with a worse hand than our pocket 7s? And now we are losing to pretty much all of my opponent's value bets on the river, which would be heart flushes, 2 pairs, so it's a little bit of a tricky spot, but exploitatively I do lean towards a fold, and so I did toss my cards in and my opponent takes it down. Unfortunately, we don't get to see what he has. In this hand, I get to play a fun one that I get to review later in a spot where I wasn't sure what to do. So there was a bunch of limps, and then it's my turn on the button, and I look down at 2 red 10s. I'm going to try and raise to a size where I can isolate and get heads up against my opponents. I raise to $20. The player to my left, the pretty sticky one, he makes the call out of the small blind, and luckily for us, we go heads up to a flop of 6, 7, 9 with all spades. He checks it over to me, and on this monotone board texture, we do have an overpair, we don't have a spade in our hand, so I figured our hand would want to bet for protection on this board, but being this monotone texture with our exact hand, I wasn't sure what sizing to choose. As you can see, when the button checks to us on this board texture, our range is going to be full of mixes, meaning we're going to be checking some, betting some, so we do have a few options here. But with our exact hand, pocket 10s with no spade in them, we definitely want to lean towards betting about half of the time. And when we bet here, we don't need to bet too big, so we should be betting about 33% pot, so I bet $10. It's going to be very hard for my opponent to continue on this type of board texture unless of course he flops some sort of combo draw, a hand with a spade in it, so we don't have to bet big. My $10 bet works as my opponent pretty much snap folds, and we get to take this one down and learn a little bit in this fun spot. In this hand, we face another sticky situation. There's multiple limps in early position, and then a player in the low jack raises to $15. The cutoff makes the call, it folds around to me, and I look down at king jack offsuit in the big blind. Not the best hand in the world, however, we're gonna complete here and make the call. The limpers call as well, so we are going 5 ways to a flop of king 10-6 with 2 hearts. We check it over to the original raiser, and he bets $30. Nobody folds, so we go 5 ways to a flop, which is another 6, but it brings 2 flush draws, hearts and spades. We check it over to him yet again, and he bets $60. The cutoff calls again, and now it's on me. I am not loving this situation at all. The original pre-flop raiser had been limping a lot pre-flop, so when he chooses to raise pre-flop, I know he has somewhat of a decent hand. He's barreling into multiple players, pre-flop, flop, and turn, so he is showing a lot of strength. At this point, I'm thinking he has pocket aces, ace king, or at worst, a hand like king queen. And I'm losing to all of those. Plus, the river can bring a lot of cards we don't want to see. We won't want to see any heart, any spade, any ace, and our hand really can't improve, unless we hit exactly a jack, of course. So for all those reasons, I decide on the fold, although tough with our exact hand. The river rolls off and my opponents check it down, and the original raiser did indeed have king queen, so we did save some money there thankfully. However, now we are stuck even more money. I had to top up another $100, so now we are in this game for $750, and now we have a stack of $300. In this hand, the $5 straddle is on, and it folds to me in early position, and I look down at 7-9 of hearts. A pretty loose open, however, at this point in the session, I'm starting to gain a really good grasp on the table and feel like I can outplay people post-flop, so I'm going to start opening up my range a little bit more. And this suited one gapper is going to be in the mix, so I raised to $15. Only the straddler calls, who's a very, very loose player. We head to a flop of ace-ace-5 with the 5 of hearts. He checks it over to me, and on this board texture, we have massive range advantage. My opponent pretty much isn't going to be able to continue with almost his entire range, which is so great for us, and for all those reasons we get to bet very, very small with our whole range on this board. So I bet $10, and my opponent pretty much snap folds, and we take it down with our 9 high. In this hand, under the gun raises to $6, which is a very small raise considering how the table was playing. The cutoff calls, and then I look down at pocket tens on the button. This raise under the gun seems very weak. I don't think he'd be doing this with a lot of his really strong value hands. It's probably a hand like a small pocket pair, maybe some offsuit Broadway hands, or a suited connector, something that my opponent wants to see a flop with but doesn't want to invest a lot of money in pre-flop. So for all these reasons, I raised to $25. The original raiser calls, and another player in middle position calls, so we're gonna go 3 ways to a flop of queen 8-8 rainbow. They check it over to me, and on this board, we're either way ahead or way behind. Our hand also does need protection. We don't really want to see any Broadway cards come off. I don't need to bet very big, so I bet $30 into this pot, and they both fold pretty quickly, so we take down a nice one. In this hand, we play the most interesting pot of the night. Middle position raises to $10, and I'm next to act and look down at 7-5 of diamonds. Normally in this spot, I would like to isolate, put in the 3-bet, and go heads up. However, I elected to call. Multiple players to my left call, so we are actually going to go 6 ways to a flop of queen 10-5 with all spades. I'm already mentally checking out and moving on to the next hand. The flop checks around, but the turn brings the 5 of clubs, so now we have upgraded our hand from bottom pair to trips. It checks around to me, and at this point, with no one putting any money in the pot, I'm going to start betting with my trips and bet $50. Only the player on the button calls, so we are going heads up to our river card, which is the 3 of hearts, an absolute blank. At this point, I have to assume my hand is good. I think my opponent would have raised or bet on the flop if he had a flush or a set, 2 pair, that type of thing. So I'm going to put out a small bet as a blocker bet and a bet for value. We can get called by all of his queen X combinations, and possibly even a 10 for this sizing. My opponent then snap raises to 125. This is a very weird move because even all of his flushes are going to take some time on the river, and it's almost impossible for him to have a full house because pocket queens and tens would have raised pre-flop, or I definitely would have heard from them on the flop or the turn. Even his 5x combinations aren't going to snap raise the river because, again, this is a monotone texture with 3 to a flush and a paired board, so he still has to worry about me having a flush or a full house as well. So I think my opponent is going to have a lot of bluffs like the ace of spades, king of spades. From a poker analytical standpoint, this doesn't make sense, and also I'm picking up a lot of tells from my opponent physically. In all other spots where he had raised the river, he looked very comfortable, and this time when I'm looking at him, he looks very agitated, like he wants me to hurry up and make a decision. He kept kind of looking over at me and looking down because of the poker standpoint and the physical tell standpoint. I think for a little bit, but then flick in the call because this just doesn't make a ton of sense. And then my opponent says those magical words, "You're good, I just have a 10. So my opponent decided to turn a 10 into a bluff. Maybe he even had a hand like ace 10 with the ace of spades. Regardless though, we flip over our trips and win a very nice pot, putting on the bluff catching cape. And one of the last hands I played for the night, there's a limp on my right and I'm next to act and look down at queen jack of hearts, definitely gonna raise and isolate. I make it $15. The player to my left calls, as he almost always does. The small blind calls and the original limper calls. So we go 4 ways to a flop of queen, deuce, 3 with 2 clubs, so we flop ourselves a pair of queens. It checks over to me and we're definitely going to bet for value. It's important to note that in theory, we can be checking this queen high board some of the time with a lot of our range, so we can mix between checking or betting. However, exploitatively, knowing my opponents are over calling a lot and have a very wide range of hands, we definitely want to charge them. So I bet 20 and only the player to my left makes the call, so we head to a turn card. The turn is the 4 of hearts, and in theory, this card really shouldn't help my opponent unless he was floating the flop with a hand like 5-6 or some sort of ace-5 suited combo, which isn't out of the realm of possibilities. Our opponent's going to have a lot of worse queens than ours or pocket pairs worse than ours, also flush draws. However, we are out of position. This was a spot at the time I wasn't sure if I was supposed to bet or check, but after reviewing it, as you can see, most of our range wants to check in this spot. Mostly it's because we're out of position. I have a very good hand, but it's not a nutted hand by any means. So I do check it over to my opponent and he checks behind. The river is the 9 of hearts, so now we definitely want to go for value, assuming our hand is good. We can get called by worse queen x, possibly some worse pocket pairs like pocket 10s, 8s, 7s, etc., or a hand like ace 9 of clubs that had a flush draw and made a nice pair on the river. So I bet $50 and my opponent pretty much snap calls. We show our hand and we're good, and we get to take down a nice pot, the last hand of the session. So that's going to wrap up this 1-2 300 max buy-in at TCH Social Las Colinas. It's time to rack up our chips, head to the cage, cash out, and head home. Well, that session definitely was not what we drove all the way out here for. Pretty unfortunate, very first hand there. Think I'm going for max value against a hand like king queen, a crying call with 2 pair, but nope, he just rivers the 6. Super unfortunate, but spent the whole rest of the time just trying to claw back and not having much success at it. Ran into some sticky spots and luckily made the right call there with our turned trips against a raise on the river, so happy about that one. Overall, felt like I played pretty decent. Perhaps maybe there were some hands I should have folded pre-flop instead of speculating, but besides that, we were in the game for $750. Cashed out for $500 for a loss of $250. Tomorrow I'm headed back to Arizona to host a meetup game. Super excited about that. After that, I will be home to play some of the Poker Atlas series here at TCH Social. But if you guys enjoyed the vlog, would you do me a huge favor and go all in and like, comment, subscribe? It would mean the world to me. We are just getting started. Hope you guys learned something today at these 1-2 cash games. I'll see you guys next time.